Madison, and today is May 29th, 2017. And I also took some inspiration from the great Mr. Rogers. I used to watch Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood when I was little. He began his program, I think, in 1968 or 1969. So when I was growing up and when I was very young in the early 70s, I used to watch Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and he would always have a positive message to help you with some aspect of your life, whether it was going off to school or dealing with anger. And then he would go into the land of make-believe. He had this trolley that would take the track over to the land of make-believe, and then in the land of make-believe, some aspect of that same lesson would be played out in the land of make-believe. And then at the end, Mr. Rogers would bring us back to out of the land of make-believe, but apply some of those lessons from the land of make-believe to our life. And for the past 8 years, I've been exploring the connection between the myths, the world's ancient myths, the mythology that's found in every culture on every inhabited continent of our planet and all the islands. The connections between the myths and ancient scriptures and sacred traditions of the world's different cultures and the stars. The connection between the myths and the heavenly cycles. I'm not the first person to explore this. I took a lot of inspiration from Hamlet's Mill, and that was published in 1969, but also going back in previous centuries. I've talked about how Robert Taylor was talking about the connection between the constellations and the stories in the Bible. He was talking about that in the early 1800s, the first half of the 19th century, in the 1820s and 1830s, but it goes all the way back to ancient figures, including Macrobius and even Aristotle and Plato, and even potentially more ancient than that. And the evidence is overwhelming that all the world's ancient scriptures and mythology, the myths and sacred stories, are actually closely related, and that they're using some common worldwide system, a very ancient system that was already in place by the time of the ancient Egyptian myths and the first texts that we have from ancient Egypt, the pyramid texts, and even ancient Mesopotamia and the first texts that we have from Mesopotamia and the Gilgamesh cycle of myths. You can see they're using this same system. So right away that shows that it must be very ancient. It predates, it was already fully formed by the time of ancient Egypt and ancient Babylon and ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer, and it's also worldwide. You can see the same system of connecting the heavenly cycles with the myths all the way around the world. You can see it in ancient Japan and ancient China, in Australia, in the islands of the Pacific, in their sacred stories, in Africa, in the ancient Greek myths, ancient Norse myths, the Celtic myths, the myths of North America and Central America and South America, in the Americas. It's worldwide, so it must be very ancient. And what I believe is that they were using these heavenly cycles as a way of explaining to us profound truths that are for each and every man and woman. They belong to all of us, and it's not about ancient figures that lived on earth. These aren't terrestrial history. These stories can be shown to be depicting patterns that take place in the heavens. So they're not about literal historical figures, but they're actually, I believe, showing us truths that apply to each and every one of us. And they relate to the interplay between an invisible realm and this visible realm. And the heavenly cycles, the constellations, the motions of the stars and planets, and the sun and the moon, and the interaction of the earth with the sun as we go around on our orbit, these heavenly cycles. There's a daily cycle where the sun rises up in the east and crosses the heavens and sinks down in the west, and the stars do that at night. Then there's also a monthly cycle that's created by the interaction of the earth and the moon and the sun. There's an annual cycle created by the orbit of the earth around the sun, and there's even longer cycles than that. And these heavenly cycles, I believe, are used to depict the interaction between the spiritual world, the invisible realm, the realm of the gods, and the visible realm, the material realm. And I've been exploring how they do that. It's like a language that they're using. I've been exploring that language for the past 8 years, and I don't claim to be fluent, completely fluent in that language, but what I've discovered, I'm trying to share that language so that others can learn it, and we can go to the myths and speak to them and listen to them in the language that they're actually speaking, which is a language of celestial metaphor. And I believe that it's much easier to understand what they're saying to us if we listen to them in the language that they're actually using to convey these profound truths to us. So to get back to the metaphor of Mr. Rogers and his neighborhood, he was going to the land of make-believe to bring these lessons out that had to do with your first day of kindergarten or dealing with anger. Well, the ancient myths, it's not a land of make-believe. The realm of the gods, the invisible realm, the ancient myths are not talking about an imaginary realm. They're talking about a real realm that they depict as present at all times. The realm of the gods, the invisible realm, is present here in the visible realm at all times, but it's difficult for us to wrap our minds around it, and it's difficult for us to see because it's the invisible realm. So they use the heavenly cycles to explain to us the reality of the invisible realm. So we'll explore that. And so what I wanted to do is, I don't claim to be a master of all the things that the myths are teaching us, but I am learning this language, and that's what I'm trying to share with you. And by learning this language, I can go to the ancient myths and see what they might be saying. I'm not saying that I manifest that lesson in my life perfectly. There's so much that I need to learn from the ancient myths, but if we can listen to them in that language, then if you can learn that language, then you can approach them for yourself. And even if you find a myth that you've never heard anyone explain before, if you understand that language, you can start to detect, well, wait a minute, I recognize this vocabulary that this myth is using. This celestial language that you start to become familiar with can help you to interpret what that myth might be saying and what message it might have for you. So I'll explore some of these messages that I believe are in some of these myths that I've talked about in some of my writings. I've now published several books, and I have a blog that's been going. Now it's well over 900 entries. So there's lots to talk about, and then we can talk about a specific lesson and then dive into not the land of make-believe, but the realm of myth, and explore how that myth might open up this teaching for us and help us to apply it to our life, because I believe these myths are ancient wisdom. They're very sophisticated, they're very profound, they're operating on many layers at once, they're very ancient, and they're very beneficial to our lives, and they belong, I believe, to each and every man and woman. There's a quotation I'm fond of citing from a scholar named Alvin Boyd Kuhn, who was a scholar of myth, and he said that we don't perceive their true meaning until you can't grasp their meaning until each one of us realizes that it's talking about us, and until you see yourself in that myth, that it's really about you. It's not about some ancient king or queen or princess or hero that lived thousands of years ago. It's about your experience. And so as we dive into the myths, we'll find things there that can illuminate, I believe, some of these truths. So I wanted to start with this question that I received. There's lots of ways you can get in touch with me on my website, which is starmythworld.com, starmythworld.com. At the bottom of any of those pages, if you scroll to the bottom, there'll be a link to a comment section where you can post a public comment if you want, and I'll try and reply to that. Or there's also on that same, if you hit comment, there's also a button you can use to send me a direct message. You can also get in touch with me through Facebook or Twitter. This is a message that was sent to me, a question that was sent to me on Facebook, and I hope that the person who sent it doesn't mind if I share their question and my response, because I thought it was a very good question. And this writer of this question had just finished reading The Undying Stars, which is a book I wrote in 2014. And so this question relates to some of the material that's in The Undying Stars. And the question says, in part, and I'll quote directly, quote, "I would very much like to know, please, and sincere apologies if I have failed to notice this aspect or capture it fully, how exactly in themselves does the power of the zodiacal constellations manifest in man?" Quote, "in man," question mark, end quote. How exactly in themselves does the power of the constellations, the zodiacal constellations, manifest in men and women? Is it, as you cite on page 33, about how the sunlight penetrates earth and man by passing through the different signs that is being commemorated, and it is this solar celestial aspect that is in itself where the power lay, and hence their enduring significance? Kind regards, and thank you in advance. P.S. By power, I also mean symbolic significance. Thank you. So here's my reply. I'll just read it directly. Quote, "This is a good question. No need to apologize at all, because it is one I have continued to explore and consider in the years since that one was written," referring to The Undying Stars in 2014. "The explanation I'd offer at this point would be that there are many layers to the answer, but that in the end, the celestial realm is used by the world's ancient wisdom as representative of the infinite realm." And I put in parentheses, implicate realm. That's something that I explore in The Undying Stars. The implicate realm, that's a term used by theoretical physicist David Bohm, who is talking about actually quantum physics and the way that particles or subatomic particles seem to exist in a state of superposition or pure potential, and then they'll manifest as either a wave or a particle. This very strange behavior really baffled physicists when they first encountered it, and that's what led to this radical rewriting of physics, quantum physics. Okay, so back to my answer here. In the end, the celestial realm is used by the world's ancient wisdom, I believe, as representative of the infinite realm, implicate realm, and that it is this realm that we are talking about, the invisible realm, through the visible markers of the heavens. The constellations of the zodiac themselves are markers on a cycle, in this case the annual cycle, that helps us understand the interplay between infinite and finite realms, in parentheses, implicate and explicate, in the interplay of light and dark throughout the year. And thus, Sagittarius or Scorpio or Virgo, etc., are reference with a T, they're reference or indicators to a larger interplay between those realms, between the higher realm and the lower realm, etc. These constellations, quote, map onto the human body, Aries associated with the top of the head, Gemini with the lungs and arms, Scorpio with the generative organs, etc., showing us that we ourselves embody and reflect the interplay between the higher and lower realms, infinite and finite. They also take on the role of the gods, but they are not, that is the constellations, the zodiac constellations take on the role of the gods, but they are not the gods themselves. It is the power of the invisible realm infinite realm that they show us. The heavens themselves are in fact infinite, so they are a perfect way for us to, quote, see the invisible or infinite realm. The gods act through us in a way. If you read the Odyssey, for instance, Athena wants to remedy the situation at the beginning of the story, and she does this by exercising her power. Hermes helps too, but does so through the actions of Odysseus. Infinite realm and finite realm acting in harmony, integrated together. I hope this answer helps. Much more could be said, but that is a summary of where I am now on the question. You may enjoy my latest book, Astrotheology for Life, which continues the exploration of this topic. I mention that because Astrotheology for Life was just published about a month ago in 2017, so it reflects a little bit of how I've been kind of developing this line of thinking since the undying stars. And then I add a PS to my response because I realized I didn't deal with a very important part of that original question about the light penetrating each and every man and woman. So I said this PS. All that being said, light itself has a dual nature, sometimes particle, sometimes wave, and I have no doubt its effects are both physical and spiritual, and thus the light we receive from the sun throughout the year, or from the stars, or reflected from the planets, has a dual impact on us as well. And thus, stargazing, and receiving that light into our eyes in physical form. As an aside, this is something that Santos Bonacci talks about in some of his videos. Thus, stargazing and receiving that light into our eyes in physical form has a dual impact as well, I am sure. Okay, so the question, how do the stars manifest themselves in us? It's a very important question, and I believe it has to do with becoming, as I said, integrated with the realm of the gods, in harmony with the realm of the gods. And there's actually a passage I wrote about recently in a blog post from the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Book of the Going Forth by Day, or Coming Forth by Day, where this is from the papyrus of An-Ni. In the ancient Egyptian Book of Going Forth or Coming Forth by Day, in the papyrus of An-Ni, there's a passage where each and every part of the body becomes associated with a god or a goddess, which is another way, a very powerful way of expressing this idea that the infinite realm is working its way out through us. But how exactly do we do that? How do we become integrated or in harmony with the infinite realm? I believe that going to the myths is a way of finding what they have to teach us about this very important concept. So let's dive in actually to the Odyssey. As you heard in my response, I refer to how at the beginning of the Odyssey the situation is not right. Things are not the way they should be, which is where we usually find ourselves in this world, when things are not the way they should be. Odysseus is separated from his family. His son is growing up without a father. His wife Penelope is raising Telemachus without Odysseus present, and he's languishing on this island. And Athena says this isn't right, and so she goes to Zeus and says, "Hey, how long are you going to leave Odysseus on that island?" And she gets his permission to go and remedy the situation. And actually Zeus sends Hermes at first, and so we get to this, the situation is not right, but the gods are going to help to fix it, but they're going to act through Odysseus. Hermes goes to Odysseus and says, "Hey, it's time to stop hanging around on this island and get back to what you're supposed to be doing. You have some duties. You have to be raising your son and taking care. Your wife is being pursued by these violent men that are trying to kill your son and take over and marry her instead, and you've got to fix the situation, and the gods have decided to let you go from this imprisonment on this island, and so make a raft. And so Odysseus does, and as he starts to sail away from the island, Poseidon sees Odysseus and becomes enraged and stirs the ocean up into a tremendous storm, enormous crashing waves and howling winds, and Odysseus is in great fear for his life, and actually another goddess comes and gives him some assistance, gives him her sash. I talk about actually the celestial foundations and connections for all of these aspects of the Odyssey in Star Myths of the World Volume 2. I spend a great deal of time, actually it's on the Odyssey. It's the biggest section of Star Myths of the World Volume 2. I spend 6 chapters on the Odyssey. Actually, it's 12 chapters, 6 chapters, and then 6 chapters of interpretation of the celestial interpretation. But let's dive in to the Odyssey itself and see how the interplay between Odysseus and the goddess Athena helps him to get out of the dilemma that he finds himself in. So I'll be reading from the translation of the Odyssey by the great Professor Robert Fagles, and this is, I believe, one of the best translations into English of the Odyssey. There's many translations of the Odyssey, but I'll read this passage where Odysseus has been flung into the ocean, and now he's been swimming for 3 days and 3 nights, and he comes upon, finally he sees an island. So let's take a look at the Odyssey. Let's go right into the myth and see how Odysseus deals with this situation. But just as great Odysseus thrashed things out, Poseidon, god of the earthquake, launched a colossal wave, terrible, murderous, arching over him, pounding down on him, hard as a windstorm, blasting piles of dry, parched chaff, scattering flying husks. So the long planks of his boat were scattered far and wide. But Odysseus leapt aboard one timber, and riding it like a plunging racehorse, stripped away his clothes, divine Calypso's gifts, and quickly, tying the scarf around his waist, he dove headfirst in the sea, stretched his arms and stroked for life itself. But again the mighty god of earthquakes spied him, shook his head, and grumbled deep in his spirit. "Go, go, after all you've suffered, rove your miles of sea, till you fall in the arms of people loved by Zeus. Even so, I can hardly think you'll find your punishments too light." With that threat, he lashed his team with their long flowing manes, gaining E.G. port, where his famous palace stands. But Zeus's daughter Athena countered him at once. The rest of the winds she stopped right in their tracks, commanding them all to hush now, go to sleep, all but the boisterous north. She whipped him up, and the goddess beat the breakers flat before Odysseus, dear to Zeus, so he could reach the Phaeacians, mingle with men who love their long oars, and escape his death at last. Yes, but now, adrift on the heaving swells, 2 nights, 2 days, quite lost, again and again the man foresaw his death. Then, when dawn, with her lovely locks, brought on the 3rd day, the wind fell in an instant, all glazed to a dead calm, and Odysseus, scanning sharply, raised high by a groundswell, looked up and saw it, landfall, just ahead. Joy, warm as the joy that children feel when they see their father's life dawn again,
one who's lain on a sickbed racked with torment, wasting away slowly under some angry power's onslaught. Then what joy when the gods deliver him from his pains. So warm Odysseus's joy when he saw that shore, those trees, as he swam on, anxious to plant his feet on solid ground again. But just offshore, as far as a man's shout can carry, he caught the boom of a heavy surf on jagged reefs, roaring breakers crashing down on an iron-bound coast, exploding in fury, the whole sea shrouded, sheets of spray, no harbors to hold ships, no roadstead where they'd ride, nothing but jutting headlands, rip-toothed reefs, cliffs. Odysseus's knees quaked, and the heart inside him sank. He spoke to his fighting spirit, desperate. "Worse and worse, now that Zeus has granted a glimpse of land beyond my hopes. Now I've crossed this waste of water, the end in sight. There's no way out of the boiling surf. I see no way. Rugged reefs offshore, around them breakers roaring, above them a smooth rock face rising steeply. Look, and the surge, too deep inshore, no spot to stand on my own two legs in battle free of death. If I clamber out, some big comber will hoist me, dash me against that cliff, my struggles all a waste. If I keep on swimming down the coast, trying to find a sea beach shelving against the waves, a sheltered cove, I dread it. Another gale will snatch me up and haul me back to the fish-infested sea, retching in despair. Or a dark power will loose some monster at me, rearing out of the waves, one of the thousands Amphitrite's breakers teem with them. Well I know the famous god of earthquakes hates my very name." Just as that fear went churning through his mind, a tremendous roller swept him toward the rocky coast, where he'd have been flayed alive, his bones crushed, if the bright-eyed goddess Pallas had not inspired him now. He lunged for a reef. He seized it with both hands and clung for dear life, groaning until the giant waves surged past, and so he escaped its force. But the breaker's backwash charged into him full fury and hurled him out to sea. Like pebbles stuck in the suckers of some octopus dragged from its lair, so strips of skin torn from his clawing hands stuck to the rock face. A heavy sea covered him over. Then and there, unlucky Odysseus would have met his death, against the will of fate. But the bright-eyed one inspired him yet again. Fighting out from the breakers, pounding towards the coast, out of danger he swam on, scanning the land, trying to find a sea beach shelving against the waves, a sheltered cove, and stroking hard he came abreast of a river's mouth, running calmly, the perfect spot, he thought, free of rocks, with a windbreak from the gales. As the current flowed, he felt the river's god, and prayed to him in spirit. "Hear me, Lord, wherever you are. I've come to you, the answer to all my prayers. Rescue me from the sea lord's curse. Even immortal gods will show a man respect, whatever wanderer seeks their help, like me. I throw myself on your mercy, on your current now. I have suffered greatly. Pity me, Lord. Your suppliant cries for help." So the man prayed, and the god stemmed his current, held his surge at once, and smoothing out the swells before Odysseus now, drew him safe to shore at the river's mouth. His knees buckled, massive arms fell limp. The sea had beaten down his striving heart, his whole body swollen, brine aplenty gushing out of his mouth and nostrils. Breathless, speechless, there he lay, with only a little strength left in him. Deathly waves of exhaustion overwhelmed him now. But once he regained his breath and rallied back to life, at last he loosed the goddess's scarf from his body, dropped it into the river, flowing out to sea, and a swift current bore it far downstream, and suddenly Ino caught it in her hands.
So this is a very illuminating passage in the Odyssey, I believe, because we see Odysseus at first when he sees this island. First, he's overjoyed. Of course, he's saved. He's made his way after 3 days off of his raft, just floating, paddling through the ocean. He sees an island, but as he gets closer, he sees that it's surrounded by a terrifying reef, jagged rocks and towering cliffs, smooth where you can't grab onto, and he despairs. And we see him actually, we get this internal narrative of his thoughts. And he starts off saying, worse and worse. First, Zeus gave me a glimpse of land beyond my hopes, and then, now, I see no way, there's no way for me to land through those jagged rocks and these giant waves crashing on that shore. And he starts to kind of go back and forth with his mind. Well, if I try and climb out, some big wave will pull me back. But if I try and swim down the coast, I'm afraid that some current will pull me back away from the island. I'll be back lost at sea again. And then his mind starts wandering to these sea monsters, and he starts thinking of, oh, Amphitrite has giant, whales and things that'll swallow me up. So his mind is actually running away with him here. You see his thoughts getting away with him, or running away with him. And Odysseus is actually noteworthy. I talk about this in Star Myths of the World, Volume 2, for his skill with words, and actually for his self-control. He's extremely self-controlled and extremely skilled with words and able to say the right thing in just about every situation. But here we get a glimpse of Odysseus. Basically, that skill, too much of a good thing, can, of course, become a bad thing. We want to be able to think, and we want to be able to think of different solutions, but if we let our mind run away with us, we can start to think of all the things that it can lead to the point where you just end up in despair, which is what we see actually happening to Odysseus in this passage. He starts off saying, I'd never be able to grab onto those rocks. Then if I start swimming down the ocean, then swimming down the beach, I'll get pulled back into the ocean. Then he ends up thinking about sea monsters that could devour him, which aren't even present in this part of the story. So his thoughts are running away with him, but then Athena helps him and inspires him. It actually says he would have been flayed alive on those cliffs if the bright-eyed goddess Pallas, that is Pallas Athena, had not inspired him at that point. So she assists him, and he begins to swim down the shore, and he finds a river mouth coming out from the island, and he senses the presence of the river god. So Odysseus is attuned to the invisible realm, and he senses the presence of the river god, and he begs as a suppliant to the river god, hey, I'm a stranger, could you please send me a favorable current? And the river god does, and he helps Odysseus get to shore. So we see Odysseus' mind running away with him. Then the goddess inspires him what to do. Then, because he is sensitive to the invisible realm, to the realm of the gods, he's able to do what Athena suggests to him. And then he's able to sense the presence of that river god. And that's how he gets out of a very dangerous situation. So whether we're actually facing a physically dangerous situation like Odysseus is in that particular story, which we might be, if our mind starts running away with us, that can be actually the worst thing. You can start to panic. But this can happen in any situation where our thoughts begin to run away with us. When you get just carried away with rage, it's usually because this kind of internal narrative is running away with you. Your thoughts are starting to think about, well, if only this, or if he hadn't done that, or if that light, if I had just made it through that red light, whatever, your thoughts running away with you is usually how your mind gets out of control. And we see Odysseus actually going into an out-of-control panic mode, where then he's thinking about the sea monsters that could eat him, and not the the problem at hand. And so there's other myths and other stories that talk about this as well. In the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna is the divine charioteer and Arjun is he's this semi-divine warrior, but he has the divine charioteer who is handling the reins of the horses and not letting the horses run away. The horses have to be under control. The god, Krishna, is actually controlling the reins. And there are other, that's from the a Sanskrit text called the Mahabharata. It's actually an epic, just like the Odyssey.
In the Mahabharata, Arjun is actually in despair before this great battle that it's like the Trojan War. Before this great battle, Arjun actually reaches a point of despair, and that's when Krishna takes him in his chariot and rides out in between the two armies. And that part of the Mahabharata is called the Bhagavad Gita, the song of the Lord. The Gita is the song, and the Lord in this case is the Lord Krishna. The God Krishna is the divine charioteer who's going to steer and control the horses in this battle for Arjun. During this great battle, Krishna is the God who's going to control the chariot, who's going to steer the chariot. And that's a very much parallels what we see going on with Odysseus here. In fact, there's other Sanskrit texts that compare the mind to the reins, and the horses are our emotions and our senses and our physical desires that want to run away with us, and the mind is the reins that control them. But the reins themselves in the Bhagavad Gita are in the hands of Krishna. So the divine higher infinite Krishna is controlling the mind, able to step back from the horses running away. As we see these horses running away with Odysseus, in his mind is running away with him, then the goddess Athena inspires him, and he's able to get things back under control and start to swim down the coast. And then he's sensitive enough to realize that the river god is there, and he pleads to the river god, and he is assisted by the river god. So the gods act through Odysseus. And we see the contrast between our thoughts running away with us and then our thoughts when they're integrated with or in tune with the realm of the gods. In the Bhagavad Gita, the divine charioteer, the Lord Krishna. In the Odyssey, it's Odysseus's thoughts are running away with him, and then the goddess Athena inspires him, and then he also becomes in tune with the river god, and he's brought safely to shore. So we can go to the myths and see how these stories explain to us the integration between the realm of the gods and our life here. And we're in this realm that's depicted as an interplay between the infinite and the finite realms. We're here in this apparently finite and material realm, but actually the invisible and infinite realm is always present. It's always actually right there if we're able to perceive it, as Odysseus does. That episode with Odysseus gives us a very graphic and dramatic picture of being able to step back from our mind running away with us. And actually, it's very interesting that Mr. Rogers would conclude his shows often with a song about, when you're angry, you don't have to let your thoughts run away with you. It's really interesting. So just like in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, you can go to the realm of the myths. It's not a land of make-believe. It's real. They're telling us real things, real truths, and they're explaining to us how we can become attuned to and in harmony with the infinite realm. I'm not claiming that I am in tune with and in harmony with the infinite realm. I'm not saying that I'm an example. I'm saying that if you learn this language, the language of the stars, then you can go to the myths and start to listen to the profound teachings that they have in the language that they're speaking, which is this language of celestial metaphor. There's blog posts where I explain how the actual chariot of Krishna and Arjun in the Bhagavad Gita can be very clearly seen in very specific constellations of the Big Dipper, the constellation Boötes, the constellation Ophiuchus, and these specific constellations, specific parts of the heavenly cycle, specific constellations point us to different parts on that cycle and have significance. The myths invest different parts of the heavenly cycle with different spiritual meanings. So it's like a code or a language that they're speaking to help us to stop just being controlled by these horses of the physical realm or our emotions and start to raise our consciousness and get in touch with the invisible realm and the gods and goddesses exercising their powers through us. So thank you for that question. I hope that we can deal with other questions. Please feel free to contact me or send them along or send back your feedback. And you can find all my work on my website, starmythworld.com. It has a section on videos that I've made, a section on podcasts where I've been on other podcasts being interviewed, a section showing the books, and you can see some sample content and the table of contents of each of my books, and then a blog with, as I said, well over 900 entries now that's fully searchable. Because this ancient wisdom is for you. It's your ancient wisdom.